It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here today and to be able to deliver a lecture to the Parkinson Disease Center at Beth Israel at Harvard, and led by the great David Simon and colleagues who have just done a wonderful, wonderful job. And I know that this patient and care partner symposium is just so meaningful for so many people. And it's really, quite an honor for me to be able to give one of your lectures today and to answer some of your questions. And so I'm going to try to inform you a bit about living with Parkinson's disease, but also ending Parkinson's, which is a project that I recently worked on with a few colleagues and friends. And so thank you again for the invitation. And I'm going to direct you here to my slides, and we're going to have a fun time chatting a bit about these two topics that are important, and we'll talk a bit about emerging therapies and answer some of your questions. So these are my conflicts of interest, and as you may note that I have many grants from the National Institutes of Health. I don't accept personal honoraria from industry sources, but some of our clinical trials are with industry partners at the University of Florida, and some of the devices that are donated for trials that I work on come from industry. So it is an important partnership. This is where I'm from, which is the Norman Fixel Institute for Neurological Diseases at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. So if you're coming down Interstate 75, come by and check us out. You can also tweet with me. My Twitter handle is @Michael Oaken. And we also have a blog that's run by Indu Subramanian, who's at UCLA, Johnny Atchison from the UK, who's a person with Parkinson and a very gifted artist, and myself, where we post a lot of free information, blog secrets, tips to living better. And so it's been a fun project, but come by and see us anytime. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about two recent projects that I've been involved with. One is about ending Parkinson's disease. And I should tell you that the original title for this book was actually called The Parkinson's Pandemic. And as you know, or many of you know that have worked with book publishers, they'll often change things, including the title. And I think they wish they could have had that one back, because no one could see that there was a global pandemic coming called COVID-19. And the idea of that book wasn't to say that we were going to end Parkinson's disease, but it was to take a careful look at all the other diseases and to try to understand what it would take to actually end or address in a meaningful way a disease. And so we took this on as a research project, as well as a fun and creative project to look to see if a framework could be hatched, from the history, from what we've learned. The other project that we recently were part of with Irene Malati, who is a neurologist at the University of Florida, and Wissam Deeb, who is a fellow of ours and a neurologist on faculty and who is now not too far down the road here at UMass, we wrote a book called Living with Parkinson's Disease, and we worked with a publisher called Robert Rose that does a lot of famous cookbooks, and they helped us to better organize the information to try to give out a lot of those secrets and a lot of those tips so people can live better. So I'm going to try to review for you a little bit about this journey.
We have done the impossible before. The suffering we experienced, it pushed us forward. It did not stop us. Stigma was there. Our brothers and sisters marched on the streets until it wasn't. The challenge inspired us. Together, we rose to the occasion. We fought back. And we will do it again. We will end Parkinson's. Our fight begins now. We have done the.
So if we think about Parkinson, we have to ask ourselves, how big is the problem? Perhaps this is the most important question when we think about trajectory and we think about what we're taking on. And there's now data that's been published and verified through the World Health Organization and through national disease registries. And it appears that Parkinson has now become the fastest growing neurological disorder. And why? Like, why should we care? Well, if 1 in 15 people are going to get Parkinson's over a lifetime, then that's a lot of people. And if you sort of looking to your left and to your right, you realize that this becomes very common. And in fact, if you go into a room and you ask people, how many of you have a family member with Parkinson? How many of you have a friend with Parkinson? How many of you know somebody with Parkinson? You're not going to get out of that room without eventually all those hands going up. The projections are not good. This is data that was put together by Ray Dorsey, who's at the University of Rochester, and it looks at 25-year epochs. So if you look at the epoch from 1990 to 2015 of the projected number of folks with Parkinson disease, it's going to more than double to 6 million. Now, we've already lived through that 25-year epoch. Now, how about the next 25-year epoch that we are now smack in the middle of? From 2015 to 2040, we're going to see growth from 6.3 million to 12.9 million, another more than doubling. And the absolute number becomes very large, and that becomes quite a burden on both healthcare resources and utilization, not to mention suffering of a population. Now, it's important to note that the lifespan has, in fact, doubled in the past 100 years. People are living longer, and in fact, this may be the most important advance that we've seen in the last century, how much longer people live. And there are a lot of these types of graphs that you can find on the internet or in books. But somebody in 1850, before the Civil War, just before the Civil War, lived, somewhere between 37 and 40 years, something around that range. And by 1990, that same person is living to 75 years old. That's remarkable. And some people would say that this growth that we're seeing in degenerative disease is because people are living longer and our bodies aren't designed to go as long as we're seeing. And that is probably true. But when we look at this, and researchers like Ray Dorsey have looked at this carefully, age is only one factor, but it's not the only factor that's driving the growth of the disease. Now, there are multiple myths about Parkinson, and it's important to dispel these. One is that it's all due to aging, and that's just not true. One, that it's not treatable, and we'll try to address that today and even maybe give you a few tips here along the road. And also that there's nothing to be done about Parkinson's risk. If that was true, that would really fly in the face of so many research articles and so much science that's just collectively accumulating. So what is the next step for Parkinson? Where do we go? Where should we be taking things? Well, when we looked at this for the Ending Parkinson's Disease book, we began to study other diseases, take a look at cancer, diseases that are chronic, like human immunodeficiency virus, infectious outbreaks like polio. And we looked at this carefully. We realized that where there have been successes, not surprisingly, there was a formula. And the formula that we saw was what we call a pact. We need to prevent disease, advocate and be strong advocates. We need to care for the people that are suffering with the disease today. And we need to not only treat it, but develop the new next generation treatments through research. So if we talk about prevention of disease, we start to think about how are we going to do this? And there are certainly environmental factors that have been associated with the appearance of degenerative diseases like Parkinson. This is probably a reasonable place to start. There are studies looking at strategies that are not medication-based, so things like exercise and rehabilitation. And then also, could drugs or devices or combinations of therapies actually hit that P for prevent? Our best immediate chance is the environment. We know now from multiple studies that there are pesticides, and for those of you who are aficionados of language or linguistics, you know that the word side means killer in Latin, and then of course what's in front is what you're trying to kill. And so that is why you see pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and all of these different names. But we do know now from dozens of research studies that it is reasonable to begin the process of banning specific pesticides and banning specific chemicals that we know are associated or strongly associated with someone having a higher chance of getting Parkinson with a reasonable exposure. Now, the pesticide with the strongest link to Parkinson's disease has been Paraquat. And Paraquat has been banned in 32 countries, but not in the United States. And in fact, in the US, its use has doubled in the last 10 years. And if we look at the map here, so you can see sort of that heat map, you can see the area of the Midwestern United States where there's a lot of farming going on, but not the only area. You can see it throughout California and sprinkles throughout a lot of the states here. And of course, this only represents the United States and the continental United States. It's very clear if you look at the numbers, they have jumped and doubled here from the 2012 numbers to the 2016 numbers and continue to go up unchecked. And this is something that we ran a White House campaign and we asked specifically during this red card campaign. And for those of you that sent red cards with us as part of the Ending Parkinson's Disease Project and endingparkinson.org, thank you for doing that. We're making some headway and asking the Environmental Protection Agency to re-examine this. You have to ask yourself where you live, okay? For example, my house, I live in Gainesville, Florida, is about 11 miles from a Superfund site. What's a Superfund site? Well, this is where the government has agreed that there has been a spill in the environment and they need to clean it up. And you can look on the internet and Google and find where all these spills have been. They're all publicly available, and look to see what's there. And in the spill closest to my house, which is next to one of my favorite dives, which is a pizza place, has a component of something called Agent Orange that was sprayed in Vietnam to get rid of vegetation. You saw this again in the news with another agent called Agent Purple, which was a similar agent that was used during Colin Powell's time in Vietnam, and then Agent Orange more commonly after that, to get rid of all of the plants so they could see the enemy. Now, it's called Agent Orange because of the orange barrels that it was stored in, not because it turned your teeth orange or something like that. But the components in Agent Orange are highly associated with a later incidence of Parkinson. And that's why, if you're a veteran and you were exposed, you may be eligible for benefits. Now, there are 23 such Superfund sites in the Silicon Valley region, like right where Google and all these really famous places sit. And so you'd be surprised how many of these, where they are, and what is in the Superfund sites. And one of the chemicals that I want to draw your attention to is in this blue barrel called Trichloroethylene, or TCE. It's commonly used in dry cleaning. And you can see here, even in a letter that from the 1932 Journal of the American Medical Association, the famous journal JAMA, still around today, they talk about promotional activities seeking the extension of TCE have failed to disclose the toxic nature of the chemicals and practical dangers that attend its use. Very high, what we call odds ratios. That's like if you went to Las Vegas and you made a bet of how, whether or not, if you were exposed to this, if you get Parkinson, a very high risk would come out, and that would be called a high odds ratio. So this is a chemical that's associated with Parkinson. So when we think about prevention, we've got to think about what can we do. I draw your attention to two examples, Paraquat and Trichloroethylene. How about advocacy and advocating? And what did we learn from different diseases? And let me focus on just two examples and just say we need to do a better job of advocating. And so we talk about polio and HIV. And in polio, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a big proponent for the Infantile Paralysis Foundation, seen here with the director, and they were able to bring in very famous people like Eddie Cantor had a radio show and others to get behind that effort. In fact, people mailed dimes to the White House. Now, we actually thought about doing this for Parkinson's disease, and we actually had a Give a Dime campaign, but our dimes had to be paper, and it was the principle, because it's now illegal to mail tender to the White House, as it probably should be. But the idea of how strong this advocacy effort was, how many people got behind it, and how the strength of the advocacy led to the eradication of the disease. Something important to learn here from this. In human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, you can see a similar story. Here I show you a picture of Jesse Helms, one of the persons in Congress who was, part of making legislation or not passing legislation that had to do with HIV. And the activists put a condom over his house, and it says, "A condom to stop unsafe politics. Helms is deadlier than a virus." And so they were able to sway the vote in their favor to get the resources they needed to improve the course of HIV. And they had not a seize control in terms of a violent protest, but sort of a lay down protest where they kind of took over the FDA. And of course, they had the quilts on the National Mall. And this was a serious advocacy effort for HIV that really moved the needle. So I ask you, how do you grade the response of what we've done for Parkinson? Could it be better? Has it been disappointing? Does the disease continue to grow unchecked? I know what my opinion is, but what's your opinion? And what do you think we should do about it as an organization, as a group of people, as people walking on that road together? And I would challenge us to do more. Now, since the publication of the book, there was a group called the PD Avengers, like the capes that you wear, and they are awesome, and they're led by Larry Gifford from Canada, or lives in Canada. Actually, I think he's from Ohio. And you can join that group. And this is a grassroots movement that's gotten behind the PACT: prevent, advocate, care, and treat. So our advocacy has got to get better. Now, what about care for the people who are suffering with the disease now? Well, we certainly need to develop better treatments. And so I put forth this as one example. A number of years ago, we wrote 10 Secrets to a Happier Life. And I think a lot of the tips there are useful. The Parkinsons Foundation, we have a free helpline, 1-800-4-PD-INFO. Many of you may not be aware there are letters and numbers on the keypad of your telephone. And so if you spell out 1-800-4-PD-INFO, you can get one of our awesome Parkinson's nurses. And then Irene Malati Wissam and I put out this book recently, which has a lot of great tips. And I think it's important to point out when we're treating Parkinson that it's not this old-fashioned image. And this is a very nice article in JAMA Neurology by Melissa Armstrong, showing the old picture, the sketch in 1886 by Gowers of Parkinson, and how it's not really accurate and doesn't really bring in the modern ideas of what Parkinson's disease looks like. And she tried to show this with both men and women, younger people and elderly people, the changes with medications, the activity. You can see how active this young woman is and how different it is, as well as the motor and non-motor features. So when we're living with Parkinson's disease, we have to remember you may be walking next to lots of people with Parkinson, and if they're well treated and well cared for, you may not even notice they have Parkinson. It's very common. And Dr. Bob Dean, took these great pictures that we used for each chapter in the book to show the faces of people with Parkinson's. And he did a very nice caregiving symposium talking about what it was like to care for his wife when she had Parkinson. And we've learned a lot of lessons. And one of the ones I love to share with people is the idea that the right thing at the wrong time is, in fact, the wrong thing. And how important, as Joshua Harris says, many people have various forms of this quote, how important timing is. And we emphasize and overemphasize the color of the pills and which pill and who has the newest thing. But I would argue to all of you here, think a lot about when and how you're giving the medicines, and think about the timing. Timing is absolutely critical in this disease and in the care of this disease. And it is a missed art by most folks, because remember, most people who care for Parkinson are not neurologists, and there are very few who are Parkinson neurologists. Jared Kintz has a great quote called, "I have a favorite cemetery I go to because it's really clean, and the doctors and the nurses are all very nice." Love this quote, but it is a bit dark, and it reminds us that the hospital is not a safe place for folks with Parkinson. And what a great project through the Parkinson Foundation Centers of Excellence that, they probably published, double-digit number of papers over the years, and pamphlets and brochures, and got the word out and figured out a way to put together these free kits you can get by calling 1-800-4PD-INFO or getting on the website, and making sure that you're ready when you get to the hospital, so that the folks that, when they're caring for you, they probably don't know anything about Parkinson. You can rip off information, say, this is the meds I should get. These are the meds I shouldn't get. This is what you should do. And being aware in care and learning to do what's important, which is to be your own advocate. And so the C in care is important. And part of that is keeping people out of the hospital. But when you do have to go to the hospital, remember what Florence Nightingale said. The very first requirement in a hospital is that it should do the sick no harm. We also talk about, what can we do in terms of treatment, and it's not all about drugs. And here you can see one of our therapists, and we talk about exercise and rehabilitation. But guess what, folks? If you're getting bad therapy is actually worse than no therapy. And timing of therapy is just as important in this intervention as it is in taking your meds. And so if you take a burst of therapy, like 6 weeks in a row, and really do great, if you stop exercising after that, it may not have a good long-term impact and reduce your falls and improve your quality of life. You need to put together a consistent program. Other things that are important, notice when people are coughing. Coughing when you're eating is not a good thing, and that should immediately prompt an evaluation by a speech and language pathologist, because the leading cause of death is aspiration pneumonia, getting food particles down the wrong hole into the lungs. We should be paying attention to these things and being preventative. So that's the C, impact. The T is in treatments, develop treatments through research. And remember, there are so many people who are waiting. And I often think of the person that's standing on top of the world, looking at their watch, that famous picture, saying, I got Parkinson and it's progressing and we got to move faster. People are waiting. And if we look at the development of treatments, that last part of the pact, historically, HIV received $3 billion a year in support from the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, the largest funder of research in the world. This prevented thousands, if not millions, of people from ever developing HIV. Parkinson's in comparison in the calendar year 2019 received about 200 million. It's estimated maybe 250 million around there now. This is not enough. We're underfunded. We're going to need to increase the critical mass of dollars going into this, which is going to grow more young researchers, which is going to get us closer to the types of answers and out-of-the-box therapies that we need by increasing this by more than 10 times. And thinking about, like, what are the therapies? What are going to be the next generation therapies? Maybe it'll be a vaccine like we're seeing for COVID-19. And of course, William Foch said that vaccines are the tugboats of preventative health, but maybe not. And in fact, in degenerative diseases, when we try to use the immune system to clear things like synuclein, and we've done this in Alzheimer's disease, sometimes it develops a situation where we get more side effects than benefit. It could develop into a situation where we clean the brain of all these bad plaques, these Lewy bodies and synuclein deposition, but the people get no better. Or maybe there's a symptomatic, maybe there's an improvement in benefit, but it doesn't change the course of the disease, or maybe it changes the course of the disease. We just don't know. And maybe it's too late. But this idea of using the immune system is something that I think has been catching some fire. Also on the horizon, the Lasker Award, which is the prelude to the Nobel Prize for at least 30+% of folks who receive it, was given to Carl Dieselroth and colleagues for optogenetics, combining genetics engineering, optics, and light-sensitive molecules. And they can do that and control these circuits and understand the circuits. If you understand the circuits, you can use guided medication therapy, guided stimulation therapies, optogenetically inspired therapies like deep brain stimulation to try to address specific symptoms. People are trying to borrow from cancer, so designer receptors exclusively activated by designer drugs, and look at those potential approaches. But whatever the approach, we're still lacking in our ability to track a disease. And people throw this term biomarker around. And of course, you could use a biomarker to diagnose a disease, but at some point it becomes obvious you have Parkinson, and we're getting better and better at diagnosing it. What I think is more important is an ability to track the disease over time with something better than a 0 to 5 scale that's very subjective. So what if you could take an image like David Valancourt did at the University of Florida and look at disease progression over time? Could that reduce the number of people you need when you're doing a trial of a drug like rasagiline or a therapy like stimulation? Could it reduce the number you need from thousands to hundreds so we could get answers faster and more accurate as to how this might change the course of disease? So having a biomarker, whether it's an image or blood or spit or skin or whatever, is going to be important. And I know that he's engaged in a large National Institutes of Health trial looking at this, and there are several other biomarker initiatives. So what are the take-home points that I'd like for you to focus on? Well, first, I want you to remember there are many things that you can do to live a better life with Parkinson's. Just because you hear those 4 words, you have Parkinson's disease, doesn't mean your life is over. And in fact, there are so many things we can do to live better. And some of them are quite simple, and we need to be integrating them into our lives. Now, if we're to have a chance at fighting Parkinson's like we did for HIV and polio and other diseases, we're going to need a plan. It's not a good idea to go into this without a well thought out plan. The plan that we would propose, and when I say we, I mean my co-authors Ray Dorsey, Bastian Bloom, and Todd Scherer, would be the PACT: prevent, advocate, care, and development of new treatments through research. We need a plan. And there are many emerging therapies, but we need to increase our commitment to funding by over 10 times. And so that was one of the things we asked for when we sent those red cards to the White House. We need to increase funding by 10 times. We need to ban some of these chemicals and ban some of these pesticides like Paraquat that are associated with a later risk of coming down with Parkinson. And we need to make sure that we're taking care into the home and that we are staying with the idea that telemedicine and moving the care to home is going to be a good thing, and it should stay on. And you all should realize you're going to need to fight to keep it on after the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of the questions that you have asked that I think are really terrific include what research is being done to understand how inflammation in the brain is connected to Parkinson's. And this is just a really thoughtful question. And the reason it's thoughtful is that we now understand that the neuroimmune system and the neuroinflammatory systems, we have these cells in our body called inflammatory cells, seem to be contributing to Parkinson. Now, we're not absolutely sure how the pieces to the puzzle fit together, but consider that there was a paper in JAMA Neurology recently where the authors looked at people that had inflammatory bowel disease, so things like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, and took a medication called TNF-alpha drug. When they took this drug, which drops inflammation, the incidence, the prevalence, how many people got Parkinson was less in the group that was taking this drug than the group that was not. So how it does it, I don't know. Is it involved? It seems to be. And could this be used for therapeutics? We hope so. Now, as more research is coming out about the role of the microbiome, what do I think about the implications for the connection between the microbiome and Parkinson? I think this is super cool. I think if you look at the research from Caltech and Emory and other groups where they've been able to manipulate the microbiome, which, by the way, is sort of all the bacteria and phages and things that live in your gut, manipulate that in animals and change the symptoms in Parkinson is really cool. We've also seen in humans this gut-brain interaction and this idea that, at least in some cases, maybe it starts in the gut. And Parkinson is beyond just a brain disease. And so when you ask me what I think the implications are, I think they're huge. And researchers have now begun to look at this. Now, the problem is the microbiome is vast. It's like a universe of stars and just unbelievable, the amounts of information, the number of things that are in a microbiome and what may or may not be implicated in disease, and whether or not if we change the microbiome, we're going to be able to treat disease. So I think, if I was going to describe it, it would be like the first couple of pages of Genesis of the Bible. We're just starting, but it's super exciting. And I think it leads to these questions like diets, preventative therapies for people who might have genes in their family. Should you do something about your microbiome, and then treatments for people who already have Parkinson? How should folks living in rural areas go about seeking medical help for Parkinson? Super, super question, really important. One of the things that we focused on when we wrote the book, Ending Parkinson's, and one of the silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic has been, using telemedicine. Now, remember, not everyone in rural areas has access to the internet, but we could get to churches, we could partner with communities, we could get lines there to get people access. And then for those who do have computers, and who are the majority of people or smartphones, we could get into their homes directly and try to push that information so they don't have to leave their house. We need partnerships. We need to get people on the ground here at University of Florida. We have Ashley Rawls, who's super interested in going into these communities and developing the partnerships that are going to be needed to build up the trust to make sure that folks are not only getting access, but guess what? Things like deep brain stimulation and other medication therapies and newer types of medicines and therapies are less accessible to people that live in rural America and less accessible to diverse populations, and that is just unacceptable. If part of Parkinson's is caused by the environmental factors and certain chemicals, what are ways we can find out if we live in an area that have these chemicals prevalent in the environment? Awesome question. Go to the internet. There's a great god named Google, and you can type in where you live and where environmental spills have been and environmental factors. A lot of this is on the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency website. There are Superfund websites and links to Superfund sites. We have at endingparkinson.org lots of information on this, and you can write in on the site endingparkinson.org if you have questions about this. And Ray Dorsey has been particularly good and is a particular expert as to where these different areas are in the communities. And he's looked at a number of these communities and is actively looking at them. And I think it's really important. Are there any non-drug options that might help with Parkinson's symptoms? Absolutely. And in fact, exercise is like a medicine for Parkinson. And if you look at the recent articles in the Lancet, there was a seminar in the New England Journal, in JAMA Neurology, there was a review article, and particularly the ones in JAMA and in Lancet talk about exercise and using these non-drug options. It's not always about the drug dealers, and how important it is not just to employ a good exercise and a consistent exercise plan, but guess what? It's really important to get physical, occupational, speech, swallow, social work, the interdisciplinary team involved early to making sure that you have the best plan. And it's not all about the drugs. And that's one of the things that I definitely want to stress today. It's not all about the drugs. So thanks for the invitation to speak. We give the proceeds of the book to Parkinson's charities. We are totally honored to be here today. Feel free to tweet me at Michael Okun or go to our blog at parkinsonsecrets.com or look us up. And we're wishing you and all of your community partners just a really, really great conference today. So thanks. It's been an honor being with you today.